The Perfect Storm wasn't just a disaster movie. It was a film where nobody survived to say what actually happened, where the actress playing the one woman who knew the truth had sworn,
"Come about, let it carry you out of there. What the hell are you doing?" Hang on!
She'd never make another water movie, where Harrison Ford passed, Nicolas Cage passed, and Mel Gibson wanted more money than the studio would spend on an entire fishing boat. And every scene aboard the Andrea Gale after her last radio contact is pure speculation. 14 things you didn't know. 1. The three men who said no. George Clooney was not Wolfgang Petersen's first choice for Captain Billy Tyne. Petersen approached Harrison Ford first. Ford declined. He then went to Nicolas Cage. Cage also turned it down. Mel Gibson expressed interest and then named a price. The studio said no. 3 of the biggest names in Hollywood passed on a film that would gross $328 million worldwide. Clooney, who got the role after all of them walked, brought something none of them might have, a specific weathered gravity that made Billy Tyne feel like a working man rather than an action star. Petersen later said Clooney understood instinctively that the character needed to be smaller than the storm, not larger. The film about 6 men swallowed by the ocean almost had a very different kind of captain. 2. The woman who begged to play herself Linda Greenlaw, the only female sword fishing captain in the American fleet in 1991, the last person to speak to the Andrea Gale, asked Warner Brothers to let her play herself in the film. She didn't just ask, she begged. The studio cast Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio instead. Their reasoning they needed a name actress to sell tickets, Greenlaw, recounting the decision later, was characteristically direct about the outcome. I guess they wanted a real actress. A female swordboat captain could have been pretty bad. She added that Mastrantonio did a good job playing her. She also noted that the film invented a romantic connection between her and Billy Tyne. There was no romantic interest. Seeing as it was George Clooney, she said, "I was cool with it." 3. The actress who swore she'd never do another water movie. Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio had been through The Abyss in 1989, one of the most notoriously miserable productions in modern Hollywood history, with days of filming in cold chlorinated water that left cast and crew physically and psychologically exhausted. She came out of it with a firm resolution: no more water movies. Petersen wanted her for Linda Greenlaw. He had to negotiate not for her salary, but for her physical safety. His promise: every single one of Mastrantonio's scenes would be filmed on land or on a boat that was not being subjected to simulated hurricane conditions. She would never be in the tank. She took the role. The promise held. Every scene in the water involved someone else. 4. The Gimbal on stage 16. The Andrea Gale's storm sequences were not filmed at sea. They were filmed on stage 16 at Warner Brothers Studios in Burbank, a soundstage retrofitted with a 20-foot deep water tank and a 6-axis hydraulic gimbal system capable of pitching and rolling the full-scale boat mock-up in any direction. Special effects supervisor John Fraser built and operated several gimbals and room roll rigs for different set pieces. Industrial fans generated wind, practical water effects, splashes, chop, spray, were layered with digital effects in post. The waves the characters are fighting on screen are a combination of the gimbal's motion, practical water thrown at the actors, and CGI ocean, rendered by industrial light and magic. The actors spent weeks soaking wet inside a soundstage in Burbank. From outside the stage, you would have heard fans and machinery. From inside the camera, it looked like the North Atlantic. 5. ILM and the photorealistic ocean. The large-scale wave and storm sequences that the gimbal couldn't provide, and the 100-foot waves, the open ocean, the rogue wave sequence, were created by industrial light and magic using CGI water effects that were, at the time, at the edge of what was possible. ILM developed photorealistic water simulation tools specifically for the perfect storm. The foam, the spray, the way light interacts with churning seawater at hurricane scale, none of it had been rendered at this level of detail before. The production received an Academy Award nomination for visual effects as a result, losing to Gladiator. What ILM built for this film influenced how water has been rendered in digital cinema ever since. The storm you see on screen was not filmed, it was calculated. Wave by wave, particle by particle, frame by frame. 6. Pure speculation. Nobody survived the Andrea Gale. This is not a minor detail. It is the central creative problem of the entire film. Everything that happens aboard the Andrea Gale after her last radio contact with Linda Greenlaw, every conversation, every decision, every moment of fear or courage or desperation, is invented. There were no witnesses. There is no record. The filmmakers, working from Sebastian Junger's book, built the final act of a true story from nothing. Greenlaw's actual last exchange with Billy Tyne, as she later described it, was unremarkable. He mentioned the weather, he asked about fishing, there was no urgency, no final declaration. Her character in the film places a Mayday relay, something Greenlaw said she never did. Because the Andrea Gale never sent a distress call, the film that feels most real in its final act is entirely the product of imagination. Every word spoken aboard that boat after the antenna snapped was written by a screenwriter in a room on land. 7. The boat that stood in the production needed a vessel close enough to the Andrea Gale to serve as her stand-in for location shooting. They found one, the Lady Grace, a commercial fishing boat nearly identical in configuration to the original longliner. Port scenes were filmed primarily in Gloucester, Massachusetts, the actual home port of the real Andrea Gale and her crew. Filming there required the cooperation of a working fishing community that had lost 6 of its own less than a decade earlier. The production worked closely with local families and the town throughout. The Lady Grace handled the practical shooting that the gimbal couldn't: dock sequences, open water approaches, vessel exteriors. She was not the Andrea Gale, but on screen, she became her. 8. The romance that never existed, the film, strongly implies a romantic tension between Captain Billy Tyne and Captain Linda Greenlaw, 2 competitive sword fishers with a charged professional relationship that carries an emotional undercurrent. Greenlaw confirmed directly there was no romance, they were colleagues, they were friends. The romantic interest between Billy and Linda was created by the screenwriters because the film needed an emotional anchor for Greenlaw's character and a personal dimension to their final radio conversation. When the film came out, Greenlaw addressed it with characteristic candor. She had no particular objection to how she was portrayed overall, but the invention of a love story between 2 working captains who had a professional friendship, that was Hollywood filling a gap with something the actual story didn't provide. 9. The lawsuit that reached the Florida Supreme Court after the film's release, the family of Captain Billy Tyne sued Warner Brothers. The charge: unauthorized commercial misappropriation and invasion of privacy. They argued the studio had used Tyne's real name and likeness without permission and had depicted him as reckless, making a deliberate choice to sail into a storm he knew could kill his crew for the sake of money. The real Linda Greenlaw supported this objection. Her one major complaint about the film was exactly the depiction of Billy Tyne as someone who knowingly drove into a storm that could kill everyone aboard. She said that was not consistent with what she knew of him. The case went to the Florida Supreme Court, which ruled against the family 6-2. The court found that depicting a historical event, even with fictionalization, was protected under the First Amendment. The studio was not required to obtain the family's permission. The ruling became an important precedent in the ongoing legal question of when a true story becomes a studio's story. Tense. The 3-hour rough cut James Horner composed the score for The Perfect Storm. His approach, as he described it, was built around warm human-type themes rather than seafaring motifs, Americana, emotional rather than nautical. He designed to make the audience feel the loss of ordinary working men rather than the spectacle of the storm. Before Horner came in, Petersen had a rough cut running close to 3 hours, nearly an hour longer than the final 130-minute release. Entire subplots and character scenes were cut. The film that reached theaters was significantly leaner than what Petersen originally assembled. The score Horner wrote for those final minutes When the themes return as the film moves toward its memorials is considered by many critics to be among his finest work. Those final minutes were also the most fiction-dependent. The warmth you feel at the end is built from scenes that never happened, scored by music that makes you feel as if they did. 11. The phrase that escaped the film. Before Sebastian Junger's 1997 book, the phrase perfect storm existed in meteorology as a technical description of conditions that combine to produce a catastrophic weather event. It was not part of everyday language. The book changed that. The film accelerated it. By 2001, perfect storm was being used in political commentary, business journalism, economic analysis, and sports reporting to describe any situation where multiple bad forces converge simultaneously. The phrase entered common English in a way that very few film-inspired terms manage. It no longer requires a capital letter or a specific weather event, a perfect storm of circumstances, a perfect storm of failures, a perfect storm. A phrase borrowed from meteorology applied to 6 men on a boat, then handed to the whole language. 12. Petersen and Das Boot Wolfgang Petersen's qualification for directing The Perfect Storm was specific and verifiable. In 1981, he had directed Das Boot, the German submarine film that earned 6 Academy Award nominations and remains one of the most physically and technically demanding productions in European cinema history. Das Boot required Petersen to film actors in confined, wet, claustrophobic conditions for an extended period, building authentic psychological pressure into every scene. The Perfect Storm required the same instincts at much larger scale, Stage 16's water tank instead of a submarine set, 6 fishermen instead of a U-boat crew, an open Atlantic horizon instead of the deep, but the core challenge in making a wet, confined, a physically miserable environment feel lived in rather than artificial, like it was something Petersen had solved 20 years earlier. The studio hired him because of Das Boot. Every time the camera finds the crew of the Andrea Gale braced against the roll of the gimbal, drenched and exhausted inside a soundstage in Burbank, that's Das Boot's DNA 13. The sound design nomination. The Perfect Storm received 2 Academy Award nominations, one for visual effects, one for sound. Both lost to Gladiator, the sound of the storm, the specific texture of wind at extreme velocities, the bass frequencies of enormous breaking waves, the layered industrial roar of a weather system large enough to have its own name, required a sound design team to build something that didn't exist in nature at a recordable scale. Real storms at that magnitude don't come with microphone placements. What the audience heard in theaters in 2000 was constructed from recorded elements, water, machinery, wind, assembled to suggest something that no human ear had survived long enough to properly document. The sound of The Perfect Storm of 1991 was invented, like almost everything else that happens in the film's second half. 14. GLOUCESTER'S Cenotaph. The memorial shown in the film is based on the real cenotaph in Gloucester, Massachusetts, or a granite monument in the harbor that lists the names of fishermen lost at sea since the city's founding in the early 1600s. Thousands of names, centuries of losses. The 6 men of the Andrea Gale are among them. The cenotaph was not built for this storm or this film. It predates both by many generations. Gloucester is a fishing city with the oldest working harbor in America, and the monument reflects that. It is not a memorial to one event, but to an entire way of life's cost. After the book was published and the film released, Gloucester saw a significant increase in visitors coming specifically to see the Cenotaph and the Crow's Nest Bar, where the crew gathered before their final voyage. The Crow's Nest is a real place. It still serves drinks. The names on the stone were there before Sebastian Junger arrived. They will be there after the film is forgotten. Which one lands? The actress who begged to play herself and was turned down? The 3 hours of rough cut that never made it to theaters, or the final act? All of it invented, every word, because no one came back to say what really happened? Drop it in the comments. Subscribe and hit the bell. More hidden histories of classic cinema coming your way. See you in the next one.